Metro News, the voice of West Virginia, presents The Blitz, a weekly breakdown of high school football throughout the Mountain State. Now, here's your host, Garrett, Cullen.
And across the state of West Virginia, online at WVMetroNews.com, Garrett, Cullen, joined by the voice of high school sports in the state, Fred Persinger. And Fred, it's semifinal week. We've got 3 games on Friday night, 3 games coming up throughout the day on Saturday, and we had a heck of a quarterfinal round, several shutouts in that quarterfinal round, and then a couple of surprises in terms of just dominating scores from the quarterfinals.
Yeah, I think you're right, Garrett. I think, in fact, there were several big surprises, and I don't think any bigger than in AAA, if you want to start there, with Point Pleasant and Huntington. I mean, my goodness, no one, and I mean no one, saw that coming. I don't think David Darst, Point Pleasant, saw it coming. I know Billy Seals didn't see it coming, but total dominance by the Big Blacks, and that's why they're in the semifinals.
Yeah, and maybe not as surprising the fact that Point won the game, but just the fact that it was 49-0 and over in a hurry. Over after the first quarter. Huntington had 4 turnovers early, 4 fumbles, and Point capitalized on those turnovers with touchdowns. Cody Mitchell, 267 yards rushing. He had 4 total scores. So the first trip to the AAA semifinals for Point Pleasant since 1979. Of course, they did make it to the AA title game back in 2011 where they lost to Wayne. But how about Cody Mitchell and the season that he's put together? Another statement-type win for him, and people looked at his stats all year and pointed to strength of schedule. Can we throw that out now? Can we finally stop talking about point schedule strength? Because clearly they're one of the title contenders in Class AAA. But you look at his numbers, 50 touchdowns on the year. He's averaging 14 yards per carry, 2,207 yards rushing, and only averaging around 13 carries per game because he's been out a lot of the time after halftime in these games for Point Pleasant. So he's just having a ridiculous year in terms of numbers, and has certainly put himself right up there at the top in the mix of 1, 2, or 3 players for the Kennedy Award and the Metro News Player of the Year Award as well.
No question, and you and I both heard during the first part of the regular season in particular, Cody Mitchell was having those same kind of stats, and folks kept saying, you just wait till they get to the playoffs and he'll be shut down. No, kid's good, and I mean, he just runs with authority. I think Marshall University is getting a tremendous player. I don't think he plays running back at Marshall. I think they'll line him up as a linebacker because he's just a really, really tough kid, but he's a good one, and he's certainly who David Darst relies on. I don't think there's any secret there.
All right, so they've got a challenge this week. You could say the same thing for their opponent, obviously, but Wheeling Park, 41-0 win over South Charleston. That was another one, Fred, where we went into it thinking it would be a little more competitive because South Charleston was finally healthy and they'd been on a roll of late. But Park, ever since that loss to Brooke, they've just put up dominant win after dominant win. Savion Johnson, 131 yards, 2 touchdowns. Quarterback Cross Wilkinson, 12 of 12 passing, 235 yards and 4 scores. Elijah Bell, 6 catches for 123 yards and 2 touchdowns. But you look at this Wheeling Park team, Fred, and we talk about Savion Johnson all the time, and deservedly so. But how about this young quarterback in Cross Wilkinson, who was 12 of 12 passing in that quarterfinal win, that dominant win over South Charleston? He's come a long way since the beginning of the season, and now they've got really an offense that can hit you on all cylinders.
Talked with head coach Chris Doherty earlier, and he was telling me that, it was a great performance because I asked about the performance of Cross Wilkinson, and he said, quite simply, though, let's be fair and give some credit to the big kids up front because he said Cross had time after time just to stay back there and find the receiver that he wanted, had time to make the throws. Now, you can't take too much away from the kid, but still, he had all kinds of time, and I think that's what they're doing. They're looking at those big lines that they have offensively and defensively. They were very, very pleased with the game plan that they had drawn up against South Charleston, who we knew had some weapons. They got healthy. Fred Crozier was back. Kentrey Greer was there. Pooh Bear was just running great. So they had a lot of weapons, but they were all shut down by a good defensive scheme and the fact that the kids up front played the game that they were supposed to play.
Yeah, so that's a battle of heavyweights. Wheeling Park, the 3 seed on the road at number 2 Point Pleasant. They met 2 years ago in the quarterfinals. Wheeling Park traveling to Point Pleasant. That was a Park win. But obviously even more on the line in this game coming up in the semifinal round. Your other Class AAA semifinal on Saturday at 1:30. Capital will be on the road at Cabell Midland. And you look back to last week, Fred. Let's start with the game that was played on Friday night. Capital beats Martinsburg 35-30. The Cougars trailed 24-14 in the third quarter. They completed that comeback, though, behind Tyree Pratt, who finished with 208 yards rushing. He threw for another 184 yards in that win. And you saw that score come through in the third quarter, and you thought, okay, here's Martinsburg, and they're just going to go back into the semifinals, and Bulldogs are back. But Capital, the defending state champions, they turned that thing in a hurry and got the 5-point win. That was a heck of an effort to come back there in the second half from Capital.
You just mentioned a name we hadn't talked about most of the season, Tyree Pratt.
Yeah.
I mean, he had been quiet. All of the talk had been about Silas Nazario, and talking with John Carpenter, for the most part, Martinsburg took Nazario out of the game plan, and Tyree Pratt put it on his shoulders and took care of the victory. But Tyree Pratt, a kid that is, had been Mr. Everything and already committed to WVU, and all of a sudden he'd been silent. But then in this game, and without question the biggest game of the season up to this point, he took advantage and took control. So they will need that certainly again, not only from Tyree Pratt this week, but certainly from all the rest of those stars at Capital.
Yeah, and we talked with Country Bays on the High School Sports Line last week. He had a nice game, nice effort last week as well for Capital. But you mentioned the game this week. They get the top seed, still undefeated, Cabell Midland. The Knights, probably a game that was a lot closer than expected throughout. It was just a 9-7 lead for Cabell Midland and facing the 9-seed Brook after three quarters, but they pulled away with a few scores in the fourth quarter. And so that final score of 30-7 it doesn't indicate how close that game really was. So I think you give Brook credit there. But certainly Cabell Midland has continued to be on a roll, and they got things together in that final quarter. This game, obviously, a rematch as well from the regular season, 21-14, a Cabell Midland win. And that was a game, Fred, when really you knew that the Knights were going to be one of those favorites in Class AAA, and you found out just how good they were, and that was going back to that regular season win over Capital.
Well, you go back to the Brook game for just a second, and what happened to Brook quite possibly will happen to Capital, and the fact that Luke Salmon said in the fourth quarter they had just worn Brook out as far as that big line that they have. They had pounded on them and pounded on them, and in the fourth quarter, Brook just didn't have anything left in the gas tank, and so Cabell Midland gets a couple of touchdowns to make that game look farther apart than it really was, and you might find that happening to Capital this weekend on the fact that Cabell Midland is just so big. They've got so much depth. They can just keep coming at you with fresh bodies, and all of a sudden you're worn out. You got your hands on your pads, and you're in trouble. And that's what happened the last time they played. And Cabell Midland, hey, you use what you've got, and they certainly got a lot of depth and a lot of talent. That's why they're undefeated.
And that's a rematch in AAA, one of those semifinals. Both AA games are rematches from the regular season as well. Let's start with Fairmont Senior at Bridgeport. Fairmont Senior playing on Friday night. They knocked off Kaiser 58-42. Polar Bears quarterback Dom Smith was terrific on the night. 28 of 39 through the air, 426 yards, 4 touchdowns. So he eclipses the 3,000-yard passing mark on the season. Fairmont Senior's Bryson Gilbert, he had a big game, including a 67-yard interception return at the end of the first half, and that really swung all the momentum into Fairmont Senior's favor. Kaiser had the momentum throughout much of the first half, and potentially was going to have a 9-point lead there at the break, and they threw a screen pass as they were driving late with about little over a minute to go in that first half. Gilbert gets the interception, takes it back for the score, and all of a sudden it's a 27-24 lead for Kaiser at the break. And Fairmont Senior just takes that momentum, builds off of it in the second half, and pulls away for a 58-42 win. You look at Bridgeport and their matchup on Saturday afternoon, 41-13 win over Robert C. Byrd. That was a 20-13 game at the half. Bridgeport had the lead, and then just a dominant second half by the Indians as they did what they've done all season, and that's just put wins after wins after wins together behind their powerful rushing attack in Dylan Tonker, Dante Bonamico. They also had a nice boost from special teams with a kickoff return for a score as well. So this rematch, Fairmont Senior Bridgeport, a 35-0 Bridgeport win in the regular season. You think back to that game, though, Fred, Fairmont Senior had 3 turnovers inside the red zone on all 3 of their first drives. Had they been able to convert those into points, maybe that's a little bit tighter of a game. Certainly, the makeup of that game would have been different, but you're going to have a perfect game if you're Fairmont Senior in order to knock off the top dog in Bridgeport.
Exact same words that J.L. Abbott used in my conversation with him this past Sunday. I asked him about the rematch, and he said quite simply, we have to play a perfect game. You cannot go and make one mistake. You can't go and stub your toe anywhere if you want to beat Bridgeport, because Bridgeport will not beat themselves, and that is going to be the key for Fairmont Senior. I still think Fairmont Senior is going to have to play a perfect game, and I think Bridgeport's going to have to put the ball on the carpet a couple of times, because Bridgeport is still so solid in every part of the game. They win every aspect of the game. That's why they're undefeated.
All right, that other AA semifinal also on Friday night. Mingo Central on the road at number 3 Tulsa. And you looked at Mingo Central last week. Big win for the Miners into their first semifinal game in that school's short history. 35-22 win over Bluefield on the road. Quarterback Stevie Hammond, 152 yards rushing, 57 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns. And you talk about guys that are in the top 5 or so in terms of the Kennedy Award and Metro News Player of the Year Award. Hammond over 2,800 total offensive yards, 46 touchdowns. So he's right there in the mix as well. And that was a huge win for Mingo Central. And you looked at Tulsa from last week. A 54-0 dominant win over Herbert Hoover. Luke Presley for them. He's been their guy on both sides of the field all season. 233 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. So this one, Fred, another rematch. It was won by Tulsa all the way back in week 2, 44-41. But a couple of teams that'll just hit you in the mouth and go at it. And that's what we're going to see coming up on Friday night between those two schools.
As you mentioned, each team has a player that can take over a game. Stevie Hammond, certainly from Mingo Central. I talked with Mike Smith, the head coach at Tulsa, and he said Luke Presley does everything for the Rebels except drive the bus. I mean, he kicks. He does. He even had a punt return, and he even had a fake punt. That the play is that he is the guy out on the field that calls. Will squeeze in a little bit when he's getting ready to punt the ball, and he can get to the edge. He's supposed to take it, ran it in for the touchdown. So, I mean, he is Mr. Everything. Presley's been doing it all. And as I mentioned, he had the broken nose last week that nobody really knew about. Certainly didn't affect his play. I asked the coach this past Sunday when I spoke with him. He said his eyes are still black and he looks horrible, but you can't get him out of the game. So, it's just a tough kid, and we all have seen what Stevie Hammond can do with the football. I think that's going to be a heck of a football game Friday night.
Potentially could be the best game of all 3 classes, in my opinion. And you just want to go back to that regular season matchup for an example. Class Single A, those 2 semifinals. About a couple of powerhouse programs in Moorfield at Magnolia. That's Saturday at 1:30, and you look to what Magnolia did. This was a Saturday night game, and beating Williamstown 14-13. Williamstown led throughout that first half and into the second half, 13-7. Magnolia able to get a score, though, and get the extra point and win by a point and hold on. Chase Street, 174 yards, 22 carries. Tyler Anderson, 95 yards, 2 touchdowns on 22 carries. Hunter Brill had 2 fumble recoveries as well for Magnolia in that win, as the Blue Eagles are back into the semifinals. And you look at Moorfield from last week, 55-26, the win over Tug Valley. They pulled away in that second half. Will Schoonover, 212 yards, 23 carries. He had 3 touchdowns. Moorfield quarterback Shane Myers, 4 total touchdowns in that win. So this one sets up to be, like I mentioned there at the beginning, Fred, a battle of top programs traditionally in Class Single A going at it here on Saturday afternoon.
No question about it. You talk about Magnolia. I got to listen to a little bit of that ball game Saturday night, and I honestly thought Williamstown was going to pull the upset until Magnolia found a way, as you mentioned, to get that touchdown late and get the extra point to go on and hold on and win. Played great defensively in the last half of the fourth quarter. For Moorfield, it was their game all the way, and they beat a very good Tug Valley team. Tug Valley beat Man by 10 in the first round, and then they had to go on the road. I get that, to Moorfield, which was not an easy trip, but still, to get beat by 29 points. I did not see that coming at all. So Moorfield just totally dominated. But as you mentioned, they've got the kids that can dominate. So with this one, I think, again, Magnolia probably got a pretty good wake-up call from Williamstown. I think they'll be ready and get a win.
And you look to that other Single A semifinal, St. Mary's on the road at East Hardy. It's a St. Mary's team we talked about at the beginning of the season, all the new guys they had in the mix, and they just kept picking up win after win. Then they had a couple of setbacks, a couple of losses coming to Magnolia and then South Harrison, so you didn't really hear a whole lot about them until they beat Buffalo last week or 2 weeks ago in the opening round of the playoffs, and then just a dominant win over South Harrison, 37-0. Wesley Parsons, 100 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. You looked at Brett Fetty. He's had a nice year, over 1,000 yards rushing. So St. Mary's getting to that single-A championship last year, falling short, of course, to Williamstown, but they're right back there with another trip to those semifinals as the 11 seed, facing the 2 seed East Hardy. And what a win it was for the Cougars last week. A field goal in the final minute of the game to beat Wheeling Central 16-14. That offensive attack from East Hardy, headed up by quarterback Corey McDonald, who's got over 2,500 passing yards, 31 touchdowns, over 1,100 rushing yards, and 17 more scores. So, Fred, this is an East Hardy offense that likes to throw the ball around, and they've done a nice job of it all season long. That's an intriguing St. Mary's East Hardy matchup Saturday night.
Yeah, I think you're right, and certainly Jody Moat chose Saturday night because he told me that's when they'll play again if they can get by East Hardy. East Hardy, to me, is the most tournament-tested team that's been through this round of 16. If you remember, they trailed 20-0 to Bishop Donahue in the first round, came back and won 23-20. They had to get a late field goal to beat Wheeling Central Catholic. First time in any kind of game they connected on a field goal and made it since 2004.
Wow.
So, I mean, you're putting all the marbles on the toe of a youngster that delivered for you to get you into the semifinals. So East Hardy, definitely tournament tested. St. Mary's, they just keep playing. Ever since those back-to-back losses in the regular season, they've been unstoppable. I think this is going to be a really good ballgame. I think these 2 games, and then, of course, we talked about already the Mingo Central-Tulsa game, those are the 3 of 6 games that I think we're really going to be watching this weekend. I think all 3 of these have a chance to be very good.
Yeah, 6 great games overall, and we'll have all the scores throughout the weekend at WVMetroNews.com. We'll get into all the games as well. Wednesday night, 7:06 until 9 o'clock on the high school sports line. We are keeping game night on Friday night. That's from 9:30 until midnight. So obviously we'll have 3 games to talk about then and still look ahead to those games coming up on Saturday. For Fred Persinger, I'm Garrett Cullen. Thanks for watching The Blitz.